Welcome to Life Stories, where we share real-life experiences that inspire, teach, and touch your heart. Today, we bring you the powerful journey of a young woman who faced betrayal, loss, and rejection from the people who were supposed to love her the most. Despite the hardship, she found her strength, built a successful life on her own, and discovered what truly matters. Join us as we dive into this incredible story of resilience and personal growth. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to start the story today. I was only 13 years old when the foundation of my life cracked and shattered. It started like any other morning. My father kissed me goodbye before leaving for work. His smile as bright as ever. He was a site manager at a construction company. Always up early, always busy. My mother didn't even look up from her phone when he left. And that struck me as strange. It wasn't like her. They used to be so in love, always holding hands and sharing little moments together. But this morning felt different. Somehow distant. My name is Emily Johnson, and that was the last time I ever saw my father alive. That afternoon, as I sat in math class, my principal called me to her office. The moment I stepped through the door, I saw my mother sitting there, her makeup as flawless as ever, like she hadn't just heard the most devastating news. Her calm, almost too calm voice broke the silence. "Your father's gone, Emily," she said, and I felt the world tilt beneath me. I didn't even know how to respond. I collapsed into tears, but my mother simply sat there, lightly patting my back as though it were nothing, like a simple inconvenience. It didn't feel real. I didn't know how to process it. Not in that moment. That evening, something changed in me. I overheard my mother speaking on the phone with her friend, Laura. I wasn't trying to listen. But our house had thin walls. And her words cut through the silence like a knife. "Actually, Laura, this might be for the best," she said, her voice almost cheerful. "Being a widow sounds better than being divorced. Plus, I get to keep everything without dealing with lawyers." Then, I heard the unmistakable sound of her laughter. She laughed. She actually laughed. My stomach twisted, and I felt bile rise in my throat. I stayed hidden on the stairs, my hand covering my mouth to stifle the scream that threatened to escape. "I'll act like the sad widow at the funeral," she continued, the words ringing in my ears. "I've already picked out the perfect black dress." I wanted to scream, to confront her, but I couldn't. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The funeral came and went. And life moved forward, or at least, it seemed that way. Everyone around me offered their sympathy, their condolences for my heartbroken mother. But Aunt Grace, my father's sister, was the only one who saw the truth. While everyone else fawned over my mother, Aunt Grace just stood there, shaking her head, as if she already knew how badly my mother had treated my father. She knew things I didn't even understand at the time. 4 months after my father's funeral, my mother wasted no time moving on. One evening, she invited a man named Peter over for dinner. Peter had 2 kids from a previous marriage, Luke, who was 12, and Lily, who was 11. They didn't feel like family to me. Not really. Mom cooked extravagant meals for them. Something she never did for Dad. She started speaking about Peter as though he were the answer to all our problems. Her voice dripping with sugary sweetness. "We're getting married, Emily," she said one evening, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Isn't it wonderful? You'll have a new father and siblings." I forced a smile, but inside, I felt sick to my stomach. It wasn't that I hated Peter, but it was the way Mom looked at him. The way she treated him as if he were everything she had ever wanted. She never looked at Dad that way. The reality hit me harder than I was willing to admit. My father had given his life to this family, working hard to provide for us. And now, in the blink of an eye, he was replaced. I was being replaced. That night, I called Aunt Grace, and I cried for hours. She listened patiently, without interrupting, and then, in her gentle way, she said something I will never forget. "Sweetheart, sometimes the family you choose is more important than the family you're born into. Don't forget that." As the weeks passed, things only got worse. Luke and Lily moved in with us just a week after the honeymoon. And everything in the house changed. They took the best rooms. And my childhood playroom was turned into Lily's art studio. I remember trying to say something about it. But my mother just told me, "Don't be selfish, Emily. We need to make them feel welcome." Her words felt like daggers. They had taken over my space, my life, and I was expected to smile and pretend everything was okay. Mom threw herself into Peter's children, helping Lily with schoolwork, attending Luke's soccer practices, but when it came to me, it was as if I no longer existed. Dinner became a solitary affair. I ate alone in my room. A space that had once felt like home but now felt more like a prison. And when I asked for something, anything, even something small like school supplies, Mom would sigh and roll her eyes. As though I were asking for too much. I stopped asking for things altogether. The harsh reality of my life had set in. I wasn't part of this new family. And I never would be. To escape, I spent more time with Aunt Grace, who treated me like the daughter she never had. When I stayed at her cottage, it felt like the only place I belonged. A place of safety and love. "This isn't right, Emily," Aunt Grace would say, shaking her head as I unpacked my bag for what seemed like the 100th time. A mother shouldn't have favorites. But I didn't know what to say. At least I had Aunt Grace. She was the only one who truly saw me. The only one who understood the pain in my heart. I didn't know it at the time. But the hardest years of my life were just beginning. The months after Mom's remarriage felt like a blur of loneliness and isolation. I had never felt so abandoned. Even though I was still living under the same roof. Mom, Peter, Luke, and Lily made up this perfect little family. And I was the odd one out. It didn't take long for me to realize that my place in the house had become insignificant. If I wasn't eating dinner alone in my room, I was being ignored. My presence merely an inconvenience to the happiness they had found without me. The turning point came when I mentioned college to Mom. At 17, I had started researching schools, particularly those with good business management programs. I had big dreams. Dreams that felt so far away. But I held on to them like a lifeline. One evening, as we sat down to a family dinner, I waited for the right moment to bring it up. "Mom, I've been looking into colleges," I said, trying to sound calm despite the nerves churning inside me. "I think I want to apply for a business management program." The silence that followed was suffocating. Mom's fork dropped onto her plate with a clang. And I saw her face go from calm to something almost like disbelief. "College?" she repeated, her voice high-pitched and incredulous. "Emily, we can't afford college. We have to think about Luke and Lily's education." I couldn't believe my ears. I knew my father had saved money specifically for my future. He had worked hard for years, cutting back on so many things just to ensure that I would have the opportunity to go to college. Luke and Lily exchanged looks. And I could see the smirks on their faces. They had always made fun of me for being the outsider in their perfect little family. And now they had the chance to rub it in even more. They didn't need to say a word. Their expressions were enough. I felt my heart sink. But I kept my composure. "What about Dad's money?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "He had life insurance. And he saved for my future. You must still have some of it left." Mom's face hardened. Her eyes narrowed as she stared at me like I had just insulted her. "I've used that money to take care of you for the past 5 years." She snapped, her voice cold and sharp. "Food, clothes, a roof over your head. Did you think that was free?" She paused, taking a deep breath as if to calm herself. "Stop acting like you deserve everything. You can't just expect things from me." I was frozen in place. My mind spinning. I couldn't believe what she had just said. I knew she was lying. Dad had worked so hard. And that money was meant for me. It had been set aside for my future. For my education. But here she was, spending it all on her new family. On Luke and Lily, while I was left behind with nothing. I didn't know how to process that level of betrayal. It was like the last piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. And I finally saw my mother for who she truly was. That weekend, I went to Aunt Grace's house. Her little cottage, tucked away from the world, had always been my safe haven. As I walked through the door, I felt the familiar comfort of being in a place where I was truly loved and valued. Aunt Grace greeted me with a warm hug. Sensing immediately that something was wrong, we sat down at her kitchen table, and I told her everything, about how Mom had dismissed my dreams of going to college, how she had lied about my father's savings, and how unfair it all felt. I cried, my tears soaking the tablecloth. But Aunt Grace just listened. She didn't interrupt. She let me get it all out. When I finished, Aunt Grace stood up and walked to her study. I could hear her opening and closing drawers. And when she returned, she had a thick envelope in her hand. She placed it gently on the table in front of me. Your father came to see me about 3 weeks before he died, she said softly. He seemed worried, like he knew something bad might happen. He gave me this and made me promise to keep it safe until you were ready for college. My hands trembled as I opened the envelope. Inside was a bank statement, showing a large savings account in my name. Aunt Grace was listed as the trustee. My father had been secretly saving money for years, just for me. I stared at the paper in disbelief. He had done it. He had protected my future. Even after he was gone. Aunt Grace placed a gentle hand on mine. Your father wanted to make sure your future was safe. No matter what, she said, her voice filled with tenderness. The money's been growing all these years. Emily, it's yours. I started crying again, but this time, it wasn't out of sadness. It was because I felt something I hadn't felt in years, hope. My father had left me this gift. This safety net, despite everything that had happened. Despite the lies and betrayal. He had protected me, and now, I could pursue my dreams. Aunt Grace smiled at me, her eyes full of pride. We can't tell your mother about this, she said, her voice firm. This is your future, Emily. Don't let her take that from you too. With a renewed sense of purpose, I focused on my studies and kept my college plans a secret. The next few years would be tough. But I was ready. I had a plan. And no one, especially not my mother, was going to take that from me. The years that followed felt like a steady march towards something greater. I didn't stop to think about the harsh reality of my home life because I had a new goal, college. I threw myself into my studies, focusing on everything I needed to do to secure my future. The money from my father's secret savings account was my lifeline, and I wasn't about to let anyone take that from me. Especially not my mother. She didn't deserve it. Graduation day finally arrived, and with it, a strange sense of freedom I hadn't anticipated. I had been counting down the days. Not because I was excited to finish high school, but because I was one step closer to leaving my toxic environment behind. My mother had barely noticed my success. She hadn't even bothered to attend the ceremony. Instead, I spent that day quietly reflecting on everything I had endured. Everything that had led me to this moment. The real surprise came shortly after graduation. My mother, Peter, and her 2 children, Luke and Lily, decided to have a serious talk with me. They sat on the couch like judges ready to deliver a verdict. And I stood before them, trying not to show how much I already hated the situation. Emily, Peter began, his voice firm. You're 19 now. We've been more than generous. But it's time for you to take care of yourself. You can't live here forever. I stood there, my heart pounding, but I forced myself to smile. I understand completely, I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. I'll be moved out by next week. They were caught off guard by my calmness. Mom opened her mouth to say something but then closed it. Her expression a mixture of surprise and confusion. Peter, ever the dictator of the house, simply nodded. Well, good, he said, his voice tinged with relief. That's very mature of you. They didn't ask where I would go or how I would manage. They didn't care. All they wanted was to rid themselves of me. They didn't want to deal with the mess that was my existence. So when I didn't argue or cry, it was like I had given them the perfect excuse to wash their hands of me. The next week, I packed everything I owned into 3 cardboard boxes and 2 suitcases. It wasn't much, but it was enough to carry my memories, my pain, and my future with me. When Aunt Grace arrived to pick me up, I watched my old house shrink in the rearview mirror as we drove away. The feeling of relief was immediate. It was as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. And I finally breathed freely again. Aunt Grace's house became my sanctuary. She welcomed me with open arms, always knowing the right words to say when I felt down, always offering her comfort without asking for anything in return. She was the mother I had always needed but never had. It was with Aunt Grace that I found the peace I needed to focus on my studies and keep my eyes on the future. Months passed, and life continued. I worked part-time at the Sunshine Cafe, serving coffee and sandwiches to customers who treated me like a person, not an inconvenience. The owner, Mrs. Walter, was kind, and she saw something in me that I didn't even see in myself. She encouraged me to keep pushing forward, to never stop reaching for more. And that's exactly what I did. I enrolled at West Virginia University, 2 states away from everything I had ever known. The first days were hard, but soon, I found my footing. The business management program was challenging, but it was exactly what I needed. I excelled in my studies, determined to make something of myself, to show everyone, including my mother, that I didn't need them. I didn't need their approval or their love. I just needed myself. Over time, I began to build a life for myself. I made new friends, people who appreciated me for who I was, not what they expected me to be. Jacqueline, my roommate, became my first real friend since middle school. She didn't know my past, but when she finally did, she didn't pity me. She simply hugged me and said, "Their loss, girl, it's their loss." But no matter how much I moved on, my mother never stopped haunting me. I would occasionally check her Instagram, just out of curiosity. It was as if she were living a perfect life, surrounded by her new family, attending soccer games and art shows, while I was completely erased from their world. There were no pictures of me, no mentions of me. It was as if I had never existed. And yet, despite all of that, it wasn't until I received a message from her, nearly 13 years after I had left, that I realized just how far she was willing to go to make herself look good. The message came one morning, like a cold slap to the face. "Betty, it's your mother. My 56th birthday is next month, and we're having a party at an expensive restaurant called El Blanc. You've probably never heard of it. I expect you to be there. It's on the 16th at 8 p.m. sharp. Don't embarrass me." 13 years. 13 years of silence. And this was her way of reaching out. A cold demand. No effort to reconnect. Just a request for something I could give her. I almost deleted the message. But something inside me stopped me. Something told me I needed to see this through. I called Mr. Eric, my boss, and asked for a week off. I wasn't going to let my mother's behavior go unnoticed. This would be the final chapter, and I would control the ending. As I prepared for my mother's birthday party, I felt a strange sense of anticipation. I wasn't nervous or anxious, just resolved. I dressed simply but elegantly in a Chanel dress, one that cost far less than the flashy outfits my mother adored. I took a taxi to the restaurant on purpose, knowing it would add to the image she had of me, a girl who couldn't afford anything on her own. But that's not who I was anymore. When I arrived at the restaurant, the scene was exactly as I expected. It wasn't a fine dining experience, it was more of a show. A place where the wealthy pretended to be important. My mother, Peter, Luke, and Lily sat at the head of the table, looking like royalty, while I quietly took my seat at the far end. My mother barely acknowledged me. But when it was time for the gifts, all eyes turned to me. I handed her a small, simple box. She immediately scowled, clearly expecting something cheap, perhaps a gift card or trinket. But when she opened it, her face went pale. Inside was a receipt for a luxury vacation to Australia, first-class flights, a 7-star resort, everything included. It was worth more than anything she could ever afford on her own. I didn't need to say much. I'm a senior director at Eric Marketing Group now. I said calmly. I own my own apartment. And that taxi you made fun of? I didn't want to leave my Mercedes parked here. The room fell silent. My mother's face turned red with embarrassment. But I didn't feel a shred of pity. I was free. And in that moment, I realized that family isn't defined by blood, it's about love, respect, and trust. I left that restaurant with my head held high, knowing I had finally made my peace with everything. If you want to hear more life stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for new videos.